Most senior candidates treat interviews like monologues, while the best candidates look at interviews as a feedback loop. How do I know this? I occasionally listen to recorded interviews of my clients, and I notice some rather subtle signs the interviewer is trying to send to the candidate, trying to help them throughout the job interviews. However, most candidates seem to be in their own world. So this is why my first piece of advice would be try to be more intentional about listening and reading your interviewer. And I know this isn't straightforward because you'd have to do two things at the same time. You'd have to at first focus on your delivery, things such as speaking the best story and clarity of thought, and then also to keep an eye on your interviewer. So if you're only getting started, I would recommend you do some role play at first to get used with this scenario. Next, I also recommend you be more positive and polite, especially during the beginning of your job interviews, during the small talk, because if you'll be able to do a good connection with your interviewer, you'll be on the same wavelength. It will be far easier for you to understand and to read their expectations during these job interviews. Also, maybe another subtle tip here. The beginning of the interview is when your interviewer will rather present themselves. And you could take some valuable insight from there in terms of the length you can expect from your answers. If they tend to be very concise, then maybe you should also consider being as concise as possible. If not, then maybe they would prefer lengthier interview answers. Okay. Next, what specifically do you have to listen to in job interviews? So interviewers, especially with high-performing, especially with FANG companies, will always ask you questions that are linked to something. If it's a technical side, it's pretty clear, but if it's the non-technical side, it's usually going to be on competencies or behaviors, things such as dealing with conflict or your judgment or your vision or your speed. And most candidates assume that it's once you understand the question they'll ask, you'll also understand the behavior or the competency behind. So I'd like to present you with a quick example here. For instance, if someone would ask you, tell me about the time when you had to handle a conflict with your manager, pretty much all candidates would understand that the competency involved would be handling conflict. So everyone would give a specific answer of a time when they handled a conflict with their manager. Now, what if I ask you something slightly different? How would you deal with conflict inside your team? Okay, so notice I open-ended. I also made this question hypothetical. Now, what happens here is that most candidates would not be inclined to give me a specific answer to this interview question, but would rather pitch their philosophy around handling conflict. And there's not many roles to which it would add great value presenting your philosophy around handling conflict. So this is why listening skills do pay off and do pay off big time, especially in non-technical job interviews. Now, how do you improve this skill? How do you improve your listening skills? I found that your ability to think on your feet, I present this in my training program, also maybe do some quizzes, to test what's the best answer, how does the best answer look like given the interview question, yields the best possible result. So it's a matter of training, and it's something extremely counterintuitive to even the most qualified candidates, right? The fourth thing I like to talk about here, which is pretty important during job interviews to why would you want to read your interviewer during the occasion, is are you giving a great answer? Okay, so believe it or not, most interviewers have their own biases. We're all human beings, and they will more often than not show their content if they are happy or not with your interview answers. So what if they're happy with your interview answer? Well, if they're happy with your interview answer, you should seriously consider going on the longer side, giving a long, convincing first answer and try to bias them to get a favorable outcome during the job interview. Now, on the other hand, if the interviewer seems skeptical about what you're saying, they might also show that during the job interview. And you should immediately become skeptical about how interesting your answer is for them. You could even stop and pause and ask them, hey, is this what you're looking for? If not, maybe present them with another question for these things. But it's critically important that you understand your interviewer's expectations throughout your job interviews, because as I said in the beginning of this video, most often than not, interviewers will try to send you some rather subtle signs throughout the job interview. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about here would be about your interviewing style. Your interviewing style, there's a preconception that people who interview quickly can also convey an idea of strength, an idea of professionalism, while in reality, many interviewers would greatly appreciate if you paused, if you did not interrupt them, for instance, but especially if you paused even for as long as 10 seconds, even if you wrote down your interview questions so you can understand them better, simply because that will allow you not only to understand what they're actually asking for, see the example with the conflict, but also allow you to pick your best stories. So in job interviews, especially in non-technical interviews, the best candidates is the one with the best stories. And it can be challenging sometimes to define what is the best approach to answer a question, which a question they might reframe, and they might reframe it counterintuitively simply because they're so easy to predict during these job interviews. So let there be no doubt, listening skills do pay off big time in job interviews, and at the end of the day, there's more than a handful of candidates who manage to bias their interviewers towards them and get a favorable recommendation simply because they were able to read the room during these job interviews.